The only other thing that could doom us is if nobody believes in a better tomorrow, because the only way you actually get a better tomorrow is if people work towards it.
Hello, this is Nick Savides, host of the Nick Sav Film and Music Show. That clip you heard was from Byron Reese's last appearance on the podcast. It's one of my favorite sound bites from the show, and Byron's only one of two guests to make a second appearance. That's fitting since this is the second episode of the relaunch version of the Nick Sav show. As I suggested in the last episode, I found myself in a broken place, and I'm doing the show as an experiment to see if it can somehow lead to better things for me and you. Each episode will address some of the big questions with which I wrestle on a regular basis, and this one's no different. Is it possible to harmoniously participate in society even when we disagree with its consensus views? Are the moments in our lives just a series of meaningless random events, or are they trying to guide us to a better destination? And how can we sustain optimism even in dystopian times? Those questions all relate because I found it harder to be optimistic since I last spoke to Byron. That's due to some societal pressures and personal heartaches. I won't get into that here, but the point is, I'm still trying. Byron's Amazon.com author bio describes him as both a futurist and an optimist. So maybe Byron Reese can help me sustain a more hopeful outlook in spite of the challenges at hand. If you can relate, maybe he can help you too. Now, my conversation with Byron is a starting point for exploring those questions, but in order to fully address them in any meaningful way, I'll have to share some personal reflections. So I'll do that in the second part of this episode, which will come out in a few weeks. In the meantime, keep those questions in the back of your mind as you listen to the conversation. Before we get to the interview, here's a quick intro to Byron Reese. His work has been featured in the New York Times, Wired, PBS, Entrepreneur Magazine, and National Geographic, just to name a few. He's been invited to speak at South by Southwest, Google, Harvard University, and other distinguished venues around the world. Byron holds 5 technology patents and has been the CEO of a few tech companies, including PageWise and GigaOM. He's currently the CEO of JJ Kent, a venture-backed tech company based in Austin. His latest book is We Are Agora, How Humanity Functions as a Single Superorganism That Shapes Our World and Our Future. It's a biology book that asks big why questions and uses wisdom from ancient Greece and Rome to reimagine what humanity is and where it's heading. Just for the sake of context, I did this interview a few months ago while I was still preparing to launch the podcast. I mention this because we talked briefly about AI, and AI tools are changing so rapidly that even a few months can feel like years of change in other industries. Our conversation is not so much about specific tools, though, but about overall tech trends, so it still relates to the developments at hand. With that out of the way, here's the interview I did with Byron a few months ago. Byron, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on the show.
Last time we spoke, you were talking about AI. You had written a book, and you were playing with the tech long before most of us had heard of ChatGPT and the like. A lot has changed since then. So I'm wondering if there are any tools that you're seeing now that you're playing with or that have changed your outlook on what AI is and what it can do.
So the book about artificial intelligence is called The Fourth Age, and I wrote that a long time ago. I guess I've written 4 books since then. And that was a book that was meant, though, to be timeless, because it's a philosophy book about artificial intelligence. I'm not supposed to say that because evidently that does not supercharge sales.
Oh, really? They tell you not to do that? Because for me, that makes it more appealing, but, not for everyone, I guess.
They didn't actually say that. It just, a philosophy book about artificial intelligence may not, I was going to call it the Zen of AI, and that would have really been putting it out there. But it was a book that was really asking, can machines be intelligent? Is it artificial because we made it the way, it just means we made it? Or is it artificial because it's not real? Like the way artificial fruit isn't really fruit, artificial turf isn't really grass. Is it intelligence, or is it something that just looks like intelligence? Or is there a difference between those two things? And then I wanted to know if it could be alive and if it could be conscious and all of that. And I liked the book because it documented a moment in time. My thinking has, I wouldn't say evolved, but it's more nuanced. And I'll tell you kind of what I think, what has struck me philosophically about the LLMs like ChatGPT. If you'll indulge me in this, this starts 4 billion years ago. So the Earth,
okay.
The Earth is formed
like way back, right? Like the ultimate broad view, way back. All right.
I think that's really where it started, because shortly after this planet cooled, life appeared here. I think it was probably came on cosmic dust, because it seems to have happened right away, and it seems to have happened fully formed, and it seems to have only happened once. And because we're all life is interrelated. We're all GTCA, DNA, all that. And in that point in time, there was
GPCA. I'm not sure.
The
what you're
DNA
referencing.
has one of its. Did you ever see a movie called Gattaca?
Yes, of course. It's been on my mind of late, actually. Yeah.
The word Gattaca is never in the movie. It's unclear what it even means, but the letters in it are G, T, C, and A, which are the first letters of what makes up the molecule of DNA.
The genome, the DNA sequencing,
Correct.
and so on.
And that's what all life is. That's why you can take a gene from a slime mold and put it in a person, and it will know what to do. It will express. At that point in the universe, as far as we know, there was one place data could be stored, and that was in DNA. And to think of DNA as a data storage device isn't a metaphor. That's all it is. DNA is not alive. It is just a book of letters, of four different characters, and that's it. It's a data storage device. And the thing about it as a data storage device is it takes a long time to write something new to it. And maybe it takes millions of years, and it has to only kind of appear by chance, and it has to mutate. And because of that, life evolved very slowly. So for 3.5 billion years, nothing happened because you had this one place to store information. And then about 500 million years ago...
Yeah, it was like using version 1.0 of the tech,
yeah,
right?
Exactly.
The sequencing, not very... It wasn't an iPhone, maybe.
No. And then 500 million years ago, something evolved called brains. And brains were nothing but a second place to store data. And they could be written to very quickly through a process called learning. And they could hold vastly more. Your DNA holds about 600 meg of data, but your brain can hold massively more. And so for the next 500,000 years, there were only two places information could be stored, DNA and brains. And then, but that extra storage place, like supercharged life. Then, about 5,000 years ago, we got a third place to store information. And that is we learned how to externalize it and write it down. And so now there are three places in the universe information can be stored, in DNA and brains and written. But the thing was that writing was very expensive and very little was saved. 99.9, as many nines as you want % of all human knowledge dies with the people who it dies with them. And then it kind of resets us.
Yeah,
back.
I mean, papyrus wasn't always long-lasting technology,
No.
right? I mean, it would decay some of it at least.
But with that, just being able to save that little bit of information, all of a sudden we got the Bronze Age, and we got Rome and Greece and everything. Then Gutenberg comes along and he makes it cheap to store information. And all of a sudden we had cheap storage. And all of a sudden now you get the scientific revolution, you get the Enlightenment, you get all of these wonderful things. Then we came along and started, but here's the problem. You start putting all those books in things called libraries, and it's almost as if they don't exist. If you can't find what you're looking for, it might as well not exist. Libraries are kind of like that last...
Yeah, I mean, they didn't have the Dewey Decimal System, and
right.
Library of Alexandria is, we lost some works.
If you wanted to find a book, you could, but if you needed a fact, that was very hard to find. Libraries are almost like that last scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark, where they're that big warehouse. So then we learned how to digitize it. I'm almost to ChatGPT. Then we learned how to digitize it, and then we could search it. But if you think about it, we still have all information siloed. When you do a search on Google for what is the difference between a cold and the flu, Google will say, I got 33 million answers to that question. Here's the first one. Here's the second one. Here's the third one.
Yeah.
And so all knowledge is siloed. We can search across all these silos very effectively with the internet, and we can find specific facts. But, and here's the payoff. I hope it's worth it. But what LLMs are, you ask that, the difference between cold and the flu, and you get one answer. And that one answer is informed by all 30 billion of those other answers. And so the LLMs are our first attempt to build a single planetary memory, a single memory of causes and effects in the universe. One single place that it can be in. And now that we're putting sensors all around the world and feeding it real-time data, it will be able to remember cause and effect. And now what you do in your life won't die with you. It will live on, and it will become the data that informs the decisions of everyone else in the future. So that in the future, not very far, everyone will be wiser than the wisest person who's ever lived, because they will have the aggregate life experiences of all of those people informing all of their decisions. So that's what I think is kind of new and different, is to think of it as finally bringing it all together. And that's what I think the big win is.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think we're just now, even after years of having this, getting used to being able to search much of knowledge and get an answer on our phones, or several answers, like you said. But then it is quite different when you go to something and it's like it's going to give you one or two answers instead of a whole flood. And by and large, at least some of the tests I've done, it's like, okay, yeah, this was a little more helpful than a Google search or whatnot. So yeah, we'll talk a little bit about your new book and the way that you expand on some of those ideas in just a moment. But I'm just curious, practically, how are you using the tech? And I'll tell you a little bit about how I'm using AI these days, and then just curious about your experiences. So the brainstorming feature is quite helpful, where you ask it to give you different ideas with generative AI, whether it's Midjourney or something else, of just rough sketches, right? Like, give me some ideas of this, or give me this in this style. And it's not always a home run for me, but it's like, okay, now I have a lot of ideas on the brainstorming side. So that's been quite helpful. And then I also like the feature of asking it to explain a concept as if I'm a teenager, or as if I'm new to the field. So I don't get the lengthy scientific papers, which are helpful, but I may not always have the nuances, the expert understanding to be able to parse that. So yeah, those are some of the ways that I use it. I'm always intrigued to hear how other people are incorporating it. So are there one or two examples of how you're using it as a writer, a thinker, or just when you're curious about something?
I don't use it.
Ah, okay.
I don't use it for two reasons.
Bold statement. So why?
One, I'm just really waiting for it to be better. When it came out, I used it and to play around with it. And I was wowed, like everybody was. You know, all the people in the AI world, we would all call each other like, holy cow, where did that come from? Like, everybody was taken off guard. And so kudos. But I remember I had just watched The Lady from Shanghai, an Orson Welles movie. There was a question I had. I didn't understand the motivation of some character. And I said, why did he do this? And it gave me this answer.
And are you asking ChatGPT or something
ChatGPT.
else? Okay.
Yeah, this was 3.5. And I said, what was the motivation of this character? And it gave me a big answer. And I was like, that doesn't sound right at all. And I'm like, are you sure? And it's like, absolutely positive. Here's what it says. And so then
Yeah.
I ran it down, and what it had were some early draft scripts that they never shot. Right? And those were given equal weight to the actual movie itself. So the technology doesn't really know what to value over other things. And so I don't really I'm interested in it conceptually, but I don't, I'm not using it. Ever since it came out, and I guess it's been a year and 5 months now, I've been researching another book, and I just read a lot for that. I'm like, I don't remember who it was who said, it was one of the people who created one of these systems, said, this is the worst LLM you will ever use in your life. And it's true, right? They're only going to get better. And so I'm going to let it bake for a few years before I start using it more. I know that's, I'm sure, very disappointing for an AI guy to say that.
No, that makes sense. I like the honesty. I will acknowledge I've had some disappointing encounters as well. So I think what tools like ChatGPT and the equivalent do well sometimes is to summarize things that are in consensus, right? So like, for example, give me a summary of a film or book sometime, or a classic book. You know, what are the key talking points? When it's more controversial, though, I have found it giving me positions that I think are biased, and I'll try to ask it as if it's a conversation. Well, why did you say this? For me, what you asked it seems a little more complex. Like, give me a character motivation, which can involve sometimes master level readings of something. You know, like you would. The world's preeminent Shakespearean scholars would probably disagree about motivation for King Lear or Cordelia or whatnot. And those would be thoughtful conversations, and they'd base it on their perspectives and what they know of the world and Shakespeare. So that seems like that is quite complicated, and I wouldn't necessarily care what a chat AI thought about that. Right. So, yeah, I think acknowledging there are still some limitations.
The universe of questions that it can answer versus the universe of questions it can't. The can't is probably 1 million to 1 billion times bigger. And it doesn't seem that way because we ask it questions we expect it can answer. And so it gets a lot of hits. But like, don't ask it who you should marry or what you should have for dinner. Don't ask it to drive a car. Right. You can teach a 16-year-old to drive a car in about 40 hours, and we've spent countless billions to try to train an AI to drive a car, and it still can't tell the difference between a bag blowing across the street and a deer running across the street. So I mean, it can't really do anything that's really useful to me, but that's fine. I know what it is, and what it is it's an attempt to consolidate all learning, and that is exciting to me. But I don't feel like I have to be the early adopter on it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason they call it the bleeding edge, because sometimes you are bleeding when you're pounding your head, like, why does this stupid thing not work?
I do think all these Mid-Journey and Dolly images that everybody uses now in magazine articles and online, I think they're going to look so dated. It's so embarrassing. I mean, they're going to be the bell bottoms and wide ties of this period of time because it's so distinctive, right. And it's so, I don't want to say lazy, but it's certainly lazy. I mean, it just drips of the moment we're in a way that I don't think is going to age well.
Let me push back on that a little bit. I wouldn't consider myself an expert by any means, but I played with some of the AI tools and taken a course from Curious Refuge on using it for video. You know, that's some of my background. And so Mid-Journey is quite robust and able to do things that, you know, in some cases it's fooled me as someone who spends much of my life studying images there were a couple where I thought, okay, I can't tell if this is real or AI generated. Now, to get some of those images, either from myself or from other people, it still takes time. It takes hours sometimes to understand what it can do and the nuances, right? So, similarly with Photoshop, like Photoshop can do the perfect circle and it can do things, but it can also do really generic clip art. And so someone still needs to understand the nuances of it to get it to do something interesting.
I'm not talking about that. I'm not questioning its prowess. The way people are using it is they'll write an article about robots being taking over restaurant jobs, and they'll go to it and they'll say, "Show me a robot in a restaurant carrying a pizza." And I mean,
right.
Obviously, it's not a real photograph of a real robot carrying a real pizza, and you can look at it and tell. And that's what I think I see everywhere is people just take like these simple prompts, and it's generated. I mean, I don't know. I call it my controversial opinion.
Yeah, I'm just saying, I'm just trying to distinguish between the people. I think there are people that use it lazily, right? So they just use the first thing, the first 5-10 minutes. But then there are others that are spending hours trying to refine it, feeding it information and using specific tags to get a very specific thing.
Yeah.
So in that regard, I think it's interesting. It will get better, right? But it's still like, okay, man,
Absolutely.
some of these things are quite compelling and even humbling. It's like, man, to do this kind of effect with computer animation, you'd have some of the demos you may have seen where it's like Fire or what is it? What's the newest OpenAI? Sora, I think. The one that's video related. So some of that particle based stuff, you'd have to be able to model an item in 3D, give it assignable properties, texture it, light it, and then create a particle system to interact and do it in more or less real time. So yeah, that kind of stuff is pretty wild, but yes, I mean, it does seem like it's in its early stages, and we'll see where it goes from there. So your newest book, Agora, it references the notion of the Greek marketplace. And so that's quite striking. You may know, I can't remember if I've told you in the past, both my parents were born in Greece, and I was born here in New York. But Greek culture is still important to me, and it's influenced my outlook. And so it was quite striking. The book was a compelling read to me, and it brought to mind Aristotle's notion of a person in politics, right? It's essentially a man is a political being by nature, or depending on the translation, a man or a person is someone who is participating in the polis in his city or her city. And to not do that is to be somehow less than a person, or to be a god that you don't need to do that, right? So it's either this person is a beast or this person is a godlike entity. And so your book brought to mind that a little bit to me. So what do you think? Is that something that resonates or not so much? And talk a little bit about your general concept of Agora that you are expanding upon in the book.
So it's a biology book. It asks a biological question. It's not a book about metaphysics. It is a book that I got the idea for when I was a beekeeper. I used to raise bees. And what I learned is that, a bee is an animal and made up of cells, just like us. But what I learned is that a beehive, a group of bees, that hive, is actually another animal. not a metaphorical one. It's another animal with all the properties of life on its own. For instance, the beehive reproduces. The beehive has an independent memory, independent of the bees. The beehive lives vastly longer than the bees. The beehive is a warm-blooded animal. It holds its body temperature to 97 degrees, whereas bees are cold-blooded animals individually. It has emergent abilities. It can do things that no bee can do. It can find an optimal new home, even though no bee knows how to do it.
And Byron, just to give some context, some people may not know the concept of emergent properties. So before you continue, just expand on that for some of us.
Emergence is a really interesting concept. It is where a system takes on properties that none of its parts have. So you can think of a clock, an old wind-up clock. None of the gears can keep time, but the clock together has this emergent property that it can keep time, even though none of the parts do. You, by the way, are an emergent creature. You're made up of cells, but none of those cells can talk. None of those cells have a sense of humor.
You're assuming I have a sense of humor, which is very kind of you there, Byron. Thank you.
See, but that was a joke right there.
Yeah.
So that is what emergence is. Now, there's some debates around the edges about what it is and how it's possible. But what I learned is that, cells come together and they form creatures. Creatures can come together, like the bees, and form another animal. And then we call that animal a superorganism. It's a creature made up of other creatures. Now, people don't normally think about it, but people are superorganisms too, individually. You're made up of all these cells, and every cell is alive. I could take you apart a cell at a time, and I could put each of those cells in a petri dish. And when I was done, they would all still be alive, but you will have vanished. So then it's like, well, what were you? Were you ever even there? What you are is a different pattern, a different arrangement, a pattern in that same matter. So you exist and your cells exist in the same matter, but it's not like your roommates. It's not like they get half the body and you get half the body. You're a different level of organization. So the question I wanted to know, and again, it's a biological question, do a group of humans form an animal, an actual creature that maybe is conscious, maybe thinks and has a will? And I didn't know when I started writing the book what I would conclude. I really didn't. And what I tried to do was I put forth hypotheses. If we are a superorganism, the following would be true. And I tested they're all falsifiable. Like you can look at them all and disagree with them and say, nope, that's not true. And so I went through this exercise and I came to the conclusion there is this creature. And I call it Agora, which is the noisy Greek marketplace where all the people are interacting. And I believe that Agora answers a question of why we are here. The scientifically answers that question. And science does not like why questions. Science likes how questions. How does this work? And how? Why? That's teleological. But I think I can answer why we are here.
With a setup like that, all right. Go ahead and
tune in next week, and we'll tune in next week.
That's right.
Okay, let's do that. So I wrote it. My last book, the prior book, was really a book about what makes people different than animals. And say what you will about the dolphins or the chimps or whatever, we are different. Right,
and just for reference, your last book being
it's Stories, Dice, and Rocks That Think: How Humans Learn to See the Future. No, I did that book. Before that, I did a book on waste called Wasted, and before that, so this was the most recent one beforehand. And it's like, why are people different than animals? I really wanted to answer a bigger question, which is why there's just one intelligent species on this planet. Why aren't there 10 or 50? Why is there just one? And the conclusion I have come to is that intelligence is a very volatile, very risky substance. 99.9% of all life is not intelligent, and it does just fine. The bacteria are not intelligent. They're going to do just fine. Intelligence might tend to lead itself to being overly successful and burning itself out like a cancer or blowing itself up or any of these other things. So it's a volatile substance.
Yeah. So, I mean, evolutionary wise, it could be a risk. If it's too intelligent, maybe it consumes the entire planet's resources and, everyone blows each other up, right?
Then you have to ask the question, well, then why does it evolve at all? Why wouldn't natural selection weed it out and it just never would risk it? It must serve some need, but a need. Well, so let me back up a little more. There's a theory called the Gaia hypothesis that says that all the life on this earth acts like a living system. It has nothing to do with Agora. It's just that all the life on this on planet Earth interacts with each other and holds the Earth in within ranges that are conducive to life. For instance, the salinity of the oceans has been constant for 500 million years. Why? How could that be? If every day rivers wash salt into the oceans and then the water evaporates, why wouldn't they be getting saltier and saltier? The climate of the Earth has been relatively stable, even though the sun is burning 30% hotter now than it was back in the day. The percent of oxygen in the atmosphere is held constant. And the idea is that the Earth functions like a living system. I think it is a living system. I think the Earth is alive. It's a life form. Now, but it doesn't matter whether it is alive or behaves like a living thing. What would it want? If the Earth's life is collectively alive, what would it want? Well, we can answer that. It would want what all living things want, two things. It would want to survive, and it would want to reproduce. So take that first one, survive. Should it worry about that? Absolutely. A giant asteroid will hit this planet someday. It will happen, and it will reset it all. And it's a scientific and almost certainty. So what would it need if it wanted to live? It would need to evolve a creature in abundance that had intelligence that could deflect that rock. I mean, we're already sending up something called the DART probe to push it away.
So in other words, it's a life form that is aware of its risks to survival and can anticipate.
No, none of that. See, that's what's cool. It's natural selection. Think of it this way. Planets that fail to evolve any intelligent life get hit by asteroids and they die out. Planets that evolve tons of intelligent life blow themselves up. But the Goldilocks number is 1. 1 is still risky, don't get me wrong. But planets that evolve one intelligent life form have a chance of surviving. And I think that propensity to evolve one life form, which evolved through regular old natural selection, that's what spread throughout the universe. That's when I started at the very beginning, when one of those planets finally does bite it, and it gets blown up, and all the biological matter starts drifting around, it'll land on an Earth, and it'll start to grow. And if it's of that strain that produces one intelligent life form, then it thrives until someday it eventually is destroyed, and that biological matter floats around. The idea that life came here from some other place isn't even considered fringe. It's panspermia. The variant that aliens went around and planted it is fringe, but the idea that just biological matter can drift in space and land somewhere, otherwise you don't have a way to explain why life formed immediately on this planet, why it formed fully complex.
Well, I mean, there is the faith-based outlook, right?
Absolutely.
Some creator created it or a variation of it, or the divine clockmaker or something.
Absolutely. However, what I tried to do in this book is say I want to offer a scientific way to answer why we are here. Now, so I think we're here to protect this planet. I think our star is a third-generation star. There have been 2 here before it. We're only 4 billion years in a 12 billion year universe. And I think life has been spreading around this way. This strain that occasionally produces one intelligent species has been spreading around. My falsifiable prediction is we will find alien life, and it will be our DNA. It will be GTCA. You'll be able to take a gene from that thing and pop it in a person, because I think there's only one kind of life. Now, I want to say, finally, though, that's why we collectively are here. The real question people would want to know, I think, is why am I here then? Like, what's my part in that? And I want to tell a story. It happened in 1947. This man committed suicide by jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. And there happened to be a psychologist at Stanford who studied suicide. And he's like, I'm going to go check that out. And so he goes up to San Francisco, finds the guy's apartment. And he lived alone, didn't have any particular problems or anything. But he had left a suicide note, and not addressed to anybody. He just left it on his desk. And it said, I'm going to walk to the bridge now. If one person smiles at me along the way, I will not jump. And I actually think that is, see, Agora can do anything. Agora, no person can make a smartphone, but smartphones get made. Agora makes them. Agora can put a person on the moon. Agora will be able to deflect asteroids. It will be able to do anything, but only to the extent that people, that it's functional. There's no superorganism where half the bees are plotting against the other half. That doesn't exist. That doesn't work. And so there are all these people who are trying to figure out what to do with their life. And I don't think it's any more complicated than every day try to be a slightly better person than you were yesterday. Try to be kind and nice. Just be supportive of it. And that's all it will take actually to build utopia.
I heard you mention this on another podcast interview. I can't remember who it was with, but you were basically saying that one of the big things, or it's not so much about doing the big things, although those matter, but doing the small, kind things on a regular basis, right? Like looking out for those people that might be hurting, that might be looking for that one affirming moment to keep them going. And who knows what, maybe that person had the answer to some vexing human dilemma had he been encouraged to keep pressing onward.
It sounds trite. It can sound trite. But Aldous Huxley on his deathbed said, I'm really embarrassed that after 45 years of research, the only conclusion I've come to is we should all try to be a little kinder to each other. And if you accept the idea that collectively we're incredibly powerful, then the burden on a person, no person can move Agora. It can't be done. What you're supposed to do is live your life and help other people. Make the thing just function like it would. I put in the book that 7% of people are bad. And I actually have a reason I chose 7%. And the vast majority of people, though the 93%, are generally good. Now, there's something called the overview effect. It's where astronauts go up into space. They look down at the Earth, and they're so moved by what they see, they're never the same. They get this idea of the unity of all humanity. And we can't send everybody up into space. We can't give the overview effect that way. So what I tried to do was write a book that gives you the overview effect from here. It says we're actually an animal. We're a single animal. And you may not like, the right hand may not like the left foot, but the right hand needs to realize there's no way for it to win and the left foot to lose, because we're actually part of the same literal creature who will share one ultimate fate, for good or bad.
Yeah, that's a poetic way to look at it. You mentioned in the book the I pencil essay, which I'm glad you did. That was an essay that meant a lot to me when I read it, and I'll have you summarize it in a moment. But it would be interesting to expand on that. So the idea from that essay is it's very complicated to make a pencil. No one person could do it by themselves. It would be very unlikely to be able to harvest the resources, refine it, do the massive industrial scale assembly. So you have people specializing. And in this example in the essay, it's not something that's orchestrated by the governments. There's not like, an overreaching government body that says, well, we're the pencil conglomerate. It must be done this way. We will enforce it. It's people who are skilled at certain things. They realize I'm better at maybe cutting wood than I am at, industrial design or vice versa. And I will use my abilities, and together we come together. We make this thing that is useful to people around the world. And so it seems like Agora, your concept, when it works best, it does involve people specializing, coming together, contributing to something, but it's not always necessarily orchestrated by some central entity.
It never is.
And that's kind of interesting.
It never is. So,
and talk a little bit more about that essay, and then what you think we need to allow that kind of coming together so that something similar can happen in other areas. What's the way to optimize for that so that people can just make pencils and have that emergent ability?
So yes, you summarized the iPencil essay very well. People, say, well, it's the invisible hand, Adam Smith's invisible hand that's pushing all that stuff around. And the question that nobody ever asks is, well, whose hand is that? And I think it's Agora's hand. I think that's what it is. Your body has about 250 different kinds of cells, and each of those cells does one thing, and a group of those, any of those 250, they all kind of do the same thing. They all have the same basic simple algorithms they operate off of. But in those 250 algorithms, those come together and magically form you, this emergent being. The Bureau of Labor and Statistics in the United States tracks the financial outlook for 10,000 individual jobs. There's vastly more than that, but there's 10,000 named ones that have so many people that, that they could make predictions and things like that. And so I would think of those as those 10,000 jobs as the different kinds of cells. When those people work in their job, they follow some basic algorithms, and it's always bottom up. One of the examples I use in the book is Manhattan, because it's an island, it's self-contained, and it has 10,000 restaurants. And every day, all the food has to get trucked in. And it's like, well, who's deciding how much flour to bring in for the bagels and the pizzas and all of that? Why do we usually end up about the right amount? And it's because each of those restaurant managers has their algorithm, and they're placing their orders, and it's always a ground up. When you go to hail a cab, all the cabs are not in one place. They distribute themselves around. Even though each cab driver is operating on their algorithm, they end up in different places. So it's always bottom up. The queen bee is not in charge of the beehive. It's not even a particularly good metaphor for her. Most bees never even see her, and she just is the reproductive unit. The bees each follow their own algorithms, and the hive is therefore able to have its emergent properties. So that's what it always is. It's always bottom up. You could not plan Manhattan, let alone plan the human race, 8.1 billion people.
Yeah, I mean, just to interject, there are instances where people try otherwise, right? Like the Politburo, centralized societies. And it seems like economically, those don't always work so well when you have the centralized planner who makes the broad decisions of, we're going to buy this much, or would you disagree?
No, I agree. I mean, and it's not to anybody's shame. One of the things...
It's just a lot of information for one person to have to try to fairly, unbiasedly assess. And assuming this person is not corrupt, which is also a big assumption in political entities that are open to corruption.
Absolutely. One of the things about a superorganism is that the individual parts specialize to such a degree they cannot survive on their own. That would be a falsifiable proposition that would disprove humanity being a superorganism. Can an individual person taken out of society, dropped on the proverbial desert island, generally speaking, survive and thrive? And the answer is no. But we shouldn't be ashamed.
Yeah, I mean,
of
it's kind of like a human organ, right? Like, as far as I know, a human heart by itself, while it's functioning in a distinct way, could it survive by itself without us supplementing it in the lab? I don't know. I don't think so. I'm not aware of organs that can do that.
So what I was starting to say is there's no shame in any of this. What it means is that we have all specialized, to use your thing, make our part of the pencil. And so there's no reason anybody should be able to design, manage it all. And it doesn't. I mean, that's why no two cities, if you dig up two different ant mounds, no two of them match even all that much. No two cities are even remotely alike. They're organic things that have to encode information, and so nobody could have planned that. Nobody could have designed Manhattan and arranged for all the food and all that.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of neat to see how it all comes together, even without centralized control, and yet remarkable things are possible. So I wanted to apply this to a creative field. I was reading the book and I was thinking, the superorganism that you described, that could be kind of like what happens with films or other creative entities. They're almost, in my mind, like mini superorganisms, in that with enough time, there's an essence of the team. There might be a culture that develops, something bigger than the sum of the individuals, and it comes to be this essence of the thing. This is embodying the show as opposed to just this person. This series has a feel. And so it's an interesting interplay, because you have a lot of individuals, sometimes with strong egos, sometimes with differing creative impulses. And so on the one hand, you want to allow some creative expression, some individuality. But if it's mayhem, if it's just, okay, do whatever, it's not going to be coherent. The actress coming in to give coffee is going to try to steal the scene. It's like, sweetie, thank you bringing the coffee. You did great. The scene is not about you bringing the coffee. It's about your boss losing his job, and he goes. So it's a very delicate balance between individual expression and the overall collective aim, let's say. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about what that might look like if you're trying to optimize it for that balance.
I had thought that was going to be the thing that disproved Agora, in that superorganisms require rigid conformity. If a ant starts acting weird, they just pull its legs off and kill it. Like, that's just it.
Yeah, that's the part of the book that left me a little bit disquieted. Like, okay.
However, it does seem that we don't actually have as much. We actually require an enormous amount of conformity as well in certain areas. For instance, I think the examples I use in the book is like, start wearing a cape to work and see how your career prospects go, or a monocle.
Or maybe, yeah, you mentioned a cape or monocle, or maybe even a cowboy hat, right? I'm a little unconventional amidst my group, but you give some other examples that I thought resonated, like the Pledge of Allegiance, right? So if someone pledges to, you give the Looney Tunes sign off, in the That's All Folks or some equivalent, or if someone is playing football and they decide to do ballet twirl, like, that's beautiful, not related. So you're right, there is some aspect of conformity, but we still want people, even within a team, right? So you have team dynamics, and yet at the same time, people are not in it like, look, man, I'm getting a paycheck. I'm doing it so I can thrive. My success is the reason I'm here, so I can get money and continue to support my family or whatever. So there's that dynamic even there, right? Like, even within a team, you're playing by the rules, but let's say LeBron is going to be trying to more aggressively get the ball and score more points than his teammates, because that's going to affect his salary disputes going forward. Yeah.
Yes.
Do you see what I'm saying? That there is that balance between the individual
Absolutely.
and the team.
What you really want to make sure for the superorganism to function is that in people's occupations, like what they do in their, as an example, that the algorithms they follow are predictable and they're what other people are expecting. So that if two bricklayers meet and they're working on a job together, they can exchange very little information and be able to work together. And that's what you're looking for. What you don't want, and we criminalize deviation from standard practices, by the way. If you're a neurosurgeon and you're like, well, this is how they teach in medical school, and I'm not going to do it that way. I got my own way, and then there's a bad outcome. You're criminal. You're criminally liable. So we do want people to conform in
In some things, yes. Mm-hmm. But I mean, this also raised some apprehensions in me, right? So, I mean,
well,
I agree.
Do you find our level of conformity, and I'm asking, do you find the level of conformity that our society requires stifling? Because some of the examples I give are like, you never see anybody wear half a mustache. In all my life, I've never seen somebody with half a mustache. Like, do you find it stifling, or do you find that it's a balance?
I will grant some of your points. I will grant, in the military, you want people to form and work as a unit. We come together. There's value in saying the pledge and saying we are something more than are some of our parts. We have a shared history. We have shared values. So I grant those things. At the same time, there are things that concern me in regards to how we handle this. I mean, I think you're right in observing that the superorganism, the collective, doesn't like unpredictability or lack of conformity. And we saw that in troubling ways with COVID, in my opinion. That was very much an issue. The way that it wasn't just that there are different perspectives, it was that so many people were demonized for raising questions or saying, well, that we're rushing into this thing, maybe we should step back and think about it. And, you see a little bit of this in the Twitter files, that the government was actually working with some of these entities to control the narrative, right? And so that was an issue. I mean, I faced it personally. I had, without going into my entire take on COVID, unless you really want to hear it, I will say I had people that, because even when I had my little vaccine card, because I was forced to get it by my work against my will, separate issue. But even when I would go into places and I'd have the card, some of these people actually were ready to tackle me for not having a mask. And so some of that was based on pseudoscience that has been at least severely questioned by reputable scientists. So there are at least alternative points of view. So that pressure of society to say, okay, it's an emergency, you have to comply. Like, well, no, maybe in an emergency, that's when we want to be most thoughtful about how we do this. So I can grant some of your points, but when it can go too far in my perspective.
And to be clear, in the book, I wasn't advocating for the pledge in the military. I was merely observing that.
I mean, again, I think there.
All I'm trying to do, I wasn't making any political statement. I mean, I wrote a biology book about whether the bulk of humanity demonstrates emergent capabilities when people work together. Can people actually mesh together in ways that create these in predictable ways? I'm just writing a biology book, and at first I thought, well, people are so different. It's astonishing that you would liken it to a beehive or an ant farm, which is very different than that. When I peeled it back and looked at like, okay, well, there are these different areas where we do require it, and that is enough to form the superorganism. But I wasn't any more editorializing that one way or the other.
No, I'm not saying you were, and I agree with your observations. I mean, I think you were insightful in noticing that we do these things sometimes as a society, and so my reaction is just that sometimes that can be good. In like a team that comes together with the emergent properties and that leads them to the championship, or creative people and really skilled craftsmen that come together and they make a stirring film that gets recognition, right? We acknowledge these things. Making a pencil, similar thing. But it does seem like there's also the potential that it could go awry, that there's potentially emerging properties for negative traits. I mean, I would make the argument, and I'm curious to hear your take, that ideology could be considered an emergent property. And some ideologies are good, but the ideology that came from Germany in post-World War I, right? I mean, that seems like that was not an ideal emergent quality. And, you know, even in sci-fi, right, the notion of the Borg, right, getting assimilated into this monolithic entity that you're going to be marching in lockstep to this giant thing. It does seem like there's a risk for that. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how we can encourage the better kind of emergence and have some kind of safeguards in place for when it might go astray. And before you address that, let me back up. Would you acknowledge that it's possible that an emergent property like ideology, if you grant that as an emergent property, is it possible that can go astray? And then based on that, how can we prevent the worst case scenarios?
Well, the funny thing about books is that there's an unwritten number of words they're allowed to have. And there are actually chapters in the book on all of this that got excised. So there's a chapter on war. Like, why do we have war? That would seem to be not good. I mean, that would seem to be antithetical to the notion of superorganism. There's one about monetary systems, governmental systems. Is there an ideal one that Agora functions best under? One of them is about.
Do you want to expand on those unwritten
every one
chapters
of them
or ideas?
Are huge topics.
Fair enough.
What I was going to say though is Agora can get sick, and it can get sick and make Nazis. And that's exactly what it is. That's obviously a pathological thing. Beehives can get sick, and beehives can die, and they have feedback loops, and those feedback loops can turn on themselves and can make it all worse. So it isn't all just smiling at the person walking to the bridge, but I think that is largely the remedy. Is good acts and acts of kindness do not reverberate throughout the world and with bad outcomes. You may be able to paint a carefully contrived scenario where one does, but by and large, they don't. And so I would say very much things can go awry. And the way I hope to keep that from happening is to remind people that through something like this, that we are all going to share ultimately the same fate. I don't know if it's enough. I think it is, because there was a time, we think about 80,000 years ago, when we hit a population bottleneck and we got down to just a few hundred mating pairs of humans. That's it. It's all. I mean, we were the endangered species, and living in small groups. And we had no writing, we had no government, we had no walls, we had no knowledge. Thunder and lightning must have been terrifying. We had no shelters. Well, we had rudimentary shelters at that point. We had very little, and yet, who would have bet on us? Because we weren't the biggest, the strongest, or anything. And you say, well, how did we survive that? Our darkest time. How did we survive that? Was it through fierce utilitarianism, a dog-eat-dog view of the world? No, just the opposite. Because we have remains from that time of people who had had injuries that they were clearly couldn't contribute to the group anymore, but they were cared for. We have skeletons of old people who weren't put out to the vultures, and so we fundamentally we survived our darkest, most vulnerable moments because fundamentally we are on balance good. I said 93% of us. I can't leave that unsaid. There was this guy who was trying to figure out how turtles could cross this highway. And he had this rubber turtle, and he would watch cars as they went by, and he found that 7% of people swerved to hit the turtle. A harmless turtle, an absolutely harmless turtle. 7% of people swerved to hit him. So yeah, we got those 7% of people in the world that swerved to hit the turtle. But that's not us. The 93% are people who, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, and the price of a functioning superorganism is eternal kindness.
Yeah, and I appreciate your optimism. I try to keep a hopeful outlook when I can. There are sometimes notes of dissonance that creep in, but sometimes those need to be addressed. But okay, so you mentioned in the book, I think, 6 properties of emergence, things that allow for it to happen. So let's say we're in the conceptual stage. We're about to set out on a new venture, whether it's a film, a new business making pencils, or even a self-reliant government of some kind. And we're thinking about your ideas and saying, well, yeah, it would be neat if positive emergent things come forward, but maybe not a murderous ideology that is killing potentially millions of people. So in the early stage, is there anything we can do to try to nudge the emergence, the superorganism or mini superorganism that might develop in a better way?
That's a fantastic question, and frankly, I haven't given it any thought. But as my mind is racing as we're talking about it, emergence, as we said, was when a system takes on properties none of the parts have, and it's a mystery because where did that come from? How did the new property emerge? Because it wasn't planned. Nobody said, "Aha! I want a person, and I want them to have a sense of humor, and so I will build one." Somehow it bubbles up, and without any top down from the bottom, and it's a huge mystery. And I mean, I spent the vast majority of the time writing this book trying to understand that. There are these termites that eat non-load-bearing lumber before they eat load-bearing lumber. In other words, they eat the part of the structure that's not going to fall on them before they eat the last bit that topples over. Now, they don't know what load-bearing lumber is. And so you say, well, how in the world did that ability come about? And that's what I would...
Oh, they're smart enough to realize we eat this first, and then we'll eat the last pillar that holds us up, or no?
They're not anywhere near that smart. They have
Okay.
simple
Right.
algorithms. I mean, the basic idea is somehow the load-bearing lumber, this is a guess, but the load-bearing lumber is under more stress, more strain, and so it will have a different tension or different feel to it. And ones that would eat that first eventually got killed off. And these other ones, see, when the bees find a new home and they go and they have all these different things and they take these votes and they get these quorums and there's all these criteria and all of that, none of them know what they're doing. None of them has ever done it before. They only swarm once a year, and those bees are on average 3 weeks old. So they've never done this. It's all written in their DNA. It's all encoded in that information because the bee isn't smart enough to do it. So what has to happen is this passive way of encoding information where the certain bees that don't do certain things die, propagating the other ones. But they don't know what they're doing. They're not like, okay, let's go find a new home. They don't have any idea what they're doing. They, like I said, their brains are... I mean, look, go all the way down to the very beginning. There's a thing called the nematode worm. He's the most successful animal on the planet. Some high percentage of all animals are these nematode worms. And its nervous system has 302 neurons. 302 neurons, that's it. And there's a group of people, the Open Worm Project, who have spent the last 20 years trying to model those 300 neurons to reproduce the behavior of that worm. Because that worm can find food and reproduce and all these things with 302 neurons. That's all it's got. And to date, they just haven't, not only have they not done it, they're not even sure it's possible to figure it out. So imagine our 100 million. Like, anyway, I'm pretty far afield here. To answer your initial question, which is how do you have positive properties emerge in systems instead of negative? I don't know, but it's a fantastic question. Emergence is a lot about what information you're saving and what you're doing with that information. And what happens is things can save information that are not intelligent. For instance, there's something called a desire path. That's like at a university where people kind of cut diagonally across the quad to go between two buildings.
Ah, right.
And that's called a desire path. Well, eventually the path is worn there. And that is information that's been encoded. We don't know, the data is gone. We don't know who walked across it. But we have information that that's the desired way to get from those 2 points. And every person that walks on that path is accessing that piece of information, even though they're not even aware of it. And that's what the bees and the ants all do. And we encode information in cities and houses. Everything around us, we're encoding information like that. The height of the doorknobs and all this stuff. And so I think it's going to have something to do with what information am I saving and what am I doing with it. But I don't know that. That was just, I'm going to think about that. That's a great question. That's probably going to be what I mull on this evening.
Yeah, I mean, that's not an easy question for anyone to answer. But maybe you can give us some of the specific items that lead to emergence. I want to say you broke it down to a couple of things in your book, different characteristics that are needed for emergence to happen. So maybe if you just give us a little overview of that, then that might get people thinking, okay, well, here are the conditions. If these are the conditions, then let's see if we have ideas on how to influence these things.
Okay, so I tried to develop something like a science of emergence because it's really a mystery of how these things happen from the bottom up, how these new properties emerge and endure. And to be quick, it requires an energy source, so some kind of energy. And then there has to be some information that the system is gathering. And then there has to be some communication. That's super important. Between the different parts, your cells have to talk to each other, for instance, to form you. Then there has to be some kind of cognition. And cognition is very simple. It's the ability to utilize information. So even a plant has a form of cognition. You know, you get plants that develop memories. Venus flytraps can count to 4 so they don't get triggered by raindrops. So they get information and then they can perform analysis on it. You don't have to be conscious or anything to do that, but you can still have cognition. It's just very simple cognition. And then there has to be specialization. All the different parts of the system can't be identical or nothing emergent is going to happen. So everything has to specialize. And then finally, there's the one optional one. So all of 5 of those you have to have. The optional one is technology. Technology is a force multiplier of the other 5. We can communicate faster we have energy sources and that's why, you can say putting a person on the moon or building a smartphone is this emergent property. It's an emergent ability to be sure. And we can do those sorts of things because we are able to use technology to multiply our abilities. And so that's Emergence 101.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. Those listening can think about it and see how can we aim for emergence for the good and not for the ill. All right. Well, Byron, really fascinating. This gave me a lot to think about here. Last question for you here. You make reference to a Kennedy quote towards the end of your book. JFK has been on my mind of late. He actually relates to a project I was working on, and I've read up a little bit about him and so on. So anyway, why that quote, and what does it mean to you?
I use this quote in almost all my books. It's one of the very few things I reuse, probably the only thing I can think of. And it's, in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. I don't know who wrote that for him, but it's just, I think Agora is about finding that overview effect, that commonality of us all, and I think he touches on the right things, on big ones. Biologically, we breathe the same air. Biologically, we die. We face the same great trauma. And everybody, everywhere loves their children. And so I just think it's this very unifying idea.
All right. Well, Byron, thanks so much for chatting with us. If people want to learn more about you and the book, you have a website, right? So tell us about that and maybe one of your go-to social media platforms if you have one that you use more than the others.
So I'm Byron Reese, BYRONRESE.com. And I got on early enough that I'm Byron Reese everywhere. You can even email me at byronreese@gmail. I'm Byron Reese on everywhere. So check it out.
Okay, awesome. All right,
Thanks a lot.
fantastic. Thanks for talking to us, Byron.
Bye-bye.
And that's my interview with Byron Reese. How the interview relates to those questions I mentioned at the beginning might be apparent at this point, but there's more to it than what I mentioned in the interview. You'll have to wait for the next part of this episode for me to share my full commentary. Part of it is that I'm still putting together my thoughts. I could give you a surface level response, but addressing big questions with any attempt at a personal, meaningful discussion takes some effort, at least for me. And I have some other commitments that limit how much time I can spend on the podcast. For now, I want to mention that I've recorded the beginning and concluding portions of this episode on September 23rd, 2024. You know, there was a scenario that felt real enough at one point where the day would have been very different. Part of it involved being in California to watch the second screening of the Getting Lost documentary, a tribute to the TV show Lost and its global fan base. And that documentary premiered on the 20th anniversary of the Lost pilot. There's more to it than that, but it's complicated, and this is not the place for me to try to concisely summarize that. The point here is that the scenario in question didn't happen. That may have been because it was just an out there notion, because a few people stood in opposition to the prospect, or because of some of my own missteps. Who knows? Like I said, it's complicated, and sometimes the big picture prospects need some cooperation to come together.
You know, God allegedly has bigger plans for me.
Speaking of which, I want to conclude this episode with comments that Byron made on another podcast, Tim Ventura Interviews.
The answer, if we are a superorganism, is you should just try to be kinder to people. Every day, just be a tiny bit better than you were before and live your life and do what you do.
You know, I was intrigued that Byron mentioned as much after he asked the host for 30 seconds to offer a conclusion. More conventional writers and speakers might have used that time to remind listeners to visit a website or buy a book. That's not what Byron did. He took the time to remind people about the importance of kindness. That suggests he really believes that a little more kindness than the default is the way forward. So, I'll try to heed that suggestion in the days ahead as I continue to refine my response to the interview. I'll aim to be at least a little kinder than usual each week, at least until I release the concluding part of this episode. I'm not a kindness machine, okay? Although I'm working on it. I wish I was better at that. And if I can get enough momentum to get there, I'll even aim to be a lot kinder. But my capacity for kindness is at least somewhat dependent on how kind others are to me. And not everyone has been so kind. Not exactly a groundbreaking revelation, I know. If it were easier to be kind regardless of how others treat us, then Jesus probably wouldn't have bothered to instruct us to love our enemies. Okay, now Byron is a science guy, so it might seem a little out of place to make a religious reference here, but by his own admission, he's a scientist who asks why questions, questions that religion and philosophy have been traditionally more inclined to explore. He also peppers his writing with references to literature, history, and philosophy, and his work suggests that he's at least not as antagonistic towards a spiritual outlook as certain outspoken, science-minded contemporaries. Besides, I don't see why a scientific outlook should preclude the possibility that certain spiritual leaders had insights about how to cultivate a better society. Even sci-fi films like 2001: A Space Odyssey have spiritual undertones, and even scientists like Byron seem to acknowledge that being kind to our neighbors, even those who might be enemies, is an admirable way to live. Although they may have different approaches for getting there, both scientists and people of faith, at their best, are in search of truth. So it stands to reason that there would be some overlap somewhere. That passage I was referencing where Jesus encourages us to love our enemies is from Matthew chapter 5, a chapter which ends with Jesus admonishing us to be perfect, like our Father in heaven. And the way that chapter progresses suggests that the capacity to be kind, even to those who try to hurt us, is a crucial part of moving towards a more perfect union. So we're aiming for perfection. No small thing that, right? Whether for us as individuals or as part of something bigger, perhaps the superorganism that Byron describes. Either way, sometimes perfection seems like an infinite distance away from me and my broken world. Nonetheless, I will still try to be a little kinder, if for no other reason than out of curiosity to see if doing so will alter the way I conclude this episode. By the way, that interview clip from Byron on Tim Ventura's show was posted on February 23rd, 2024. And so, my friends, the number 23 makes a dramatic appearance once again. You're still in Texas, Austin?
I am. Yeah.
Okay. I do like Texas. That's actually where I got this hat from. So.
Well, you rock that look. I would keep it.
Thank you.